right, we'll kick things off. So welcome everybody. My name is Kyle Buller. I'm one of the co-founders here at Psychedelics today, and I am joined by Emma Knighton. Really excited to have you here, Emma. And today's topic, we're going to be chatting about essential skills in education for practitioners. So I'm sure it's a topic of passion for both of us, as we've been in the education world for quite a while. And yeah, Emma, you've been at this work for quite some time. I think we came across each other in the integration world, and then you're working with APA, which was an organization that's trying to create some training standards, and also part of various psychedelic training programs, such as our program at Vital. So I'll let you introduce yourself and to the audience, and welcome.
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everyone, from wherever you're tuned in from today. It's good to see you. And my name is Emma Knighton. I use they and she pronouns, and I have a kind of many hats that I wear. But professionally, first and foremost, I'm a trauma therapist, and so I work from a somatic lens. And I work with people with complex PTSD from various forms of child abuse and how that manifests then in adulthood. I'm an educator in the psychedelic space. I do a lot of organizing work. And I am really passionate about this work being trauma informed and coming from a lens that really helps us look at the whole person. So looking at our individual histories, intergenerational histories, ancestral, and how that's all situated within the cultural societal context that we live in now. And it's been a long journey for me, and kind of weaving through different worlds of policy and education and practitioner, which I think we're going to get into today. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. I guess we'll do a little bit of an outline here. So we're going to do a little bit of a conversation for this webinar, so we can get a little bit more in the nuances of this topic. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to use the Q&A feature, which is in your toolbar in Zoom. If you're on the desktop, it's your bottom toolbar, should says Q&A, and it's on that toolbar on mobile as well if you're tuning in on the phone. So as we're talking and we're going through this material, feel free to just drop us a question. We're here for the hour. So let's see, I'm in Mountain Time right now. So we will end around 3 Mountain Time. Yeah, so I guess we'll dig in, and I guess some other context. So this is also in relationship to our Vital training program. So if you're interested in learning more about training education in the psychedelic space, you can check that out at vitalpsychedelictraining.com. So Emma, let's start with you had this position, you're a co-founder at APA, and I kind of want to start off with some of the policy, right? Because as people are getting involved in this space, they're curious, how do I get trained? What do I need to get trained in? And, there is really kind of no board or regulating body right now in the psychedelic field. I always like to remind people we're super early. Even if you feel like the ship has sailed or, so many people are doing this, we're still very early in the stages of all this stuff. And so, how are different organizations looking at what feels essential for practitioners to get trained and educated in?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. It's a good place to start. And just to tell people, APA, it stands for the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association. So if you want to look it up, if you don't know that acronym, we've got a lot of acronyms in this space in our little language. So from the organizational perspective, so I was one of the co-founders of APA and was the co-executive director for a while. I'm no longer with them. But during that time, we were really looking at okay, what does it look like to create a cohesive set of standards for practicing, so standards of care and also standards of training. So from the training perspective, and there was that kind of fed into this conversation of what does it eventually look like for psychedelic work to be covered by insurance. And there was many steps in between needing to create standards and insurance being something that we could use, but ultimately that was the kind of trajectory and the why around we were doing it, because we want this to be able to be accessible to many people. And we know that the price tag, especially for things like MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, will be quite high for psilocybin work. We're seeing that already with the rollout in Oregon, paying for people's many hours a day is a lot of money. So saying that that's kind of the end goal and why this was there in the first place on a national scale. We know that standards for training and care look different in different kind of fractal aspects of the field. But what we were really thinking about is like, what does a base level agreement between different training programs look like for what people need to be getting trained in? So things like, what are the standards around preparation? What are the standards around administration sessions? Standards around integration sessions? What kind of prerequisites do people need to have coming into training programs? There was a lot of conversation around wanting to like be aware that currently we live in a system where there's a hierarchy between licensed practitioners and unlicensed practitioners. And yet we know that much of the wisdom in this field exists in the underground, exists in traditional ceremonial contexts, exists in communities of people who are not licensed within the healthcare system. And so what does it look like to kind of flatten that hierarchy and open that up to invite everyone in and feel that everyone is represented in this work, and bringing the wisdom really from these different lineages of practice, whether it's traditional, indigenous, ceremonial, different kind of spiritual, research, clinical, like all of these things. And what is the like foundational agreements of what creates a strong, competent, ethical, accountable psychedelic practitioner. And an important note here is that this is like, when I say foundational, I mean like really truly foundational, and something that then individual training programs could build off of and make their own, depending on what kind of setting different people wanted to work in. And so that was a lot of the conversation, and that work is something that's still in progress. Those standards of training have not been published yet. There was a version of a standards of care that were published in between Brain Futures and APA. And that's something that it's an iterative process, right? So that'll be something that's built off of as we continue to learn and grow as a field.
Awesome. Thank you. You brought up a point around a lot of the wisdom exists in the underground, and this need for, licensed and unlicensed tracks. How do you think we're going to tackle that? Because I think that's like the one question we get asked mostly, like, I don't have a license, can I get involved in this field?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, how, and I know Oregon has shaped their law that if you don't need a license to become a facilitator in Oregon, but yeah, how do you see this all playing out from maybe a policy and regulation perspective?
Yeah, I think let me make sure my policy hat is on. From a policy perspective, I think that currently we have a couple different ways of access into being a legal practitioner. So we know the underground exists, but we're going to talk about, legal regulated spaces. So we have spaces like Oregon, right? Colorado's coming online. You don't have to have a license to practice in those. There's the churches, the church structure. People can practice in churches and not have a healthcare license in that space. And then, the FDA and the DEA are still in process with rescheduling MDMA and rescheduling psilocybin. And that is going to create a whole other system of access to these medicines and this work. And that much of that will be all of it will be through the healthcare system. And I know that part of the conversations that I was in, and it was a couple of years ago, so I don't know where it's at now, but things I've been hearing still is that there isn't a live conversation of what does the requirements look like from the FDA, from the DEA, from the insurance carriers of does everyone in that room need to have a healthcare license? I know there's been conversations of, could there be one person with a license and one person without a license, in order to create room for many different ways of practice and ways of being, and trying to honor those lineages and the wisdom that lives in those spaces and not recreate as much of the hierarchy as we have, understanding that we are working within the American medical system. So that's going to be there. But I think there are all these different avenues to work. And part of, for folks that are listening that want to become practitioners or maybe in their first stages of it, part of this process is really thinking about like, who do you want to be as a practitioner, and what kind of communities do you want to work with, and what kind of setting do you want to be in, and knowing that there are these different options for you. And so that would guide your decisions when you're thinking about training.
Do you think you could go into that in a little more detail, like outline maybe those roles, different settings people could get involved in? Because I'm sure this also is really new. I know a lot of people just think, hey, maybe it's just the clinical route, right? But now if things are starting to open up in really interesting ways, there are kind of different roles that you can take on. So yeah, I would love to hear you kind of outline what that looks like.
Yeah. So in terms of like if you want to be a practitioner or just like in the field.
Yeah, I guess a practitioner and then maybe also in the field as well. But yeah, we'll start with the practitioner piece.
Yeah, so as a practitioner, I mean, let's kind of go back. So I listed a couple off, right? So we've got the like um, legal regulated adult use model. So those are things like the structure in Oregon, the structure in Colorado that's getting built. Many states have their own legislature that's in process. Washington, I was a part of that effort, and that's continuing to move forward. California, Massachusetts, different states have different things going on. In that structure, so the legal regulated adult use structure, most of those policies say that you do not have to have a healthcare license in order to get trained. In Oregon here, you just have to have a high school diploma or a GED. That's the highest level of required education that you can have. And then training programs obviously have their own vetting process. But from that structure, what you would actually be doing is you are not a therapist. It's very, very clear you are not someone's therapist. You are a psilocybin facilitator, right? You're a licensed psilocybin facilitator if you're working through the state model. And so you are doing a couple prep sessions with people, you're doing medicine sessions with people, you're doing integration sessions with people. And depending on what service center you work, you have to work at a licensed service center through the Oregon model. And different service centers have different structures. We're kind of just getting these online, and so we don't know exactly, what it's going to look like long term. But right now we know that there's kind of this general arc. We're not seeing real long term care in these settings. Most people, if they need longer term support, are referred out to therapists, to peer support structures, to chaplains, right, to people who do more of that long-term care. And so there's individual work. A lot of people are doing group work as well. And that's a really good model for working with different communities for accessibility, and also group work is just fantastic. Yeah, so that's one model and what that can typically look like. And then I don't know as much about the church model, but I have lots of colleagues and friends who do work within that space. And it is a church model, right? So it's more of like, you are a psychedelic minister, a chaplain, like these are the words that we hear in reference with that. And it's more of a community oriented space, right? And so I think a lot more group sessions, there is individual work that comes in there, but it is less like the Oregon model is a kind of in between of the community model and the healthcare model. We've got the church model, which is much more focused on spirituality, much more focused on community oriented care. I think has much more of a grassroots energy around it often. And then we have the medical model, which is coming more online, but we are seeing with ketamine assisted psychotherapy and what that looks like now. And that is a very unregulated space currently. And the work that's being done in the MAPS studies with MDMA, with the different psilocybin studies that we're seeing, that we've had for decades. And that model is still getting built yet, but likely like the information we do have is that will probably look much more medicalized. It'll look more sterilized than the Oregon model, than the church model. We may have some room. We don't know yet. Hopefully we can have art on the walls and comfortable settings and, able to be in clinics that are in nature, but that there will be more of a medicalized feel to it. And that likely it will be two practitioners in the room with someone. That's not a for sure thing yet, but that's the conversation that's been happening and the model that we're seeing in most of the research studies. And that there's somebody that will need to do medical screening and prescribe the medicine for that person, and will be kind of more of a structured state. But I think also what that does is it opens us up to probably have more longer term preparation, more longer term integration, because insurance might be covering it and because people are able to function under healthcare licenses, which is set up to do that. Whereas in the Oregon model, the facilitator licenses are not set up to be doing long-term therapy work. That's actually a very strong boundary in that within the Oregon regulations.
Right. Yeah, I remember
Question,
the
Kyle?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a question in the Q&A. We'll get to that since you brought up
Yeah.
churches, but just the comment too around, there's a lot of discussion around like psychedelic assisted therapy, right? And when we think of the Oregon model, maybe we think that there's the therapy component. And so getting clear on scope of practice here and thinking about like what is the role of a psilocybin facilitator, because I know some of the boards kind of oppose some of it, and saying that like that doesn't fall under the scope of practice for like psychologists and counselors, right? So as a
Yeah.
licensed professional, you can't offer, even if you get trained as a facilitator, you can't practice quote unquote psilocybin assisted therapy because Oregon is under this kind of adult use model and you're a facilitator. So what does a facilitator mean in Oregon? Like what type of service or what's your scope there?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question by adding one thing too, of that when you're in your facilitator role, let me back up. So I'm a licensed therapist. When I'm in my therapist role, I cannot be practicing psilocybin services when I'm in my therapist role. When I'm in my psilocybin facilitator role, I can't be practicing therapy services as well. So it goes both ways, and this gets real confusing. And there was a lot of like struggle and controversy around this when the rules are being built, and still is, frankly, within the field. And it's a conversation a lot of us are having. And so thinking about like, if you are somebody who doesn't have a healthcare background and you are coming in and getting trained as a psilocybin facilitator in Oregon, you're going to be learning therapeutic tools. Like I teach at a handful of these training programs, have helped develop one of them. And I'm the director of education at one of them. And we are teaching a lot of tools that you learn when you're getting trained to be a therapist, but they are for psilocybin services, right? So things like how to have a healing relationship with someone, what to do when transference comes up, how to work with clients' trauma histories in the moment. But understanding that your scope is that you are preparing someone for a psilocybin session. And that means a lot of different things. But within this scope, it's preparing the relationship. It's talking about consent. It's talking about what they're wanting to get out of it, setting goals, setting expectations, doing work maybe with fear that's arising, talking about how their family system is going to support them, talking about practices to start doing so that when integration comes around, there's things that they are already have in their life that they can kind of use for integration, right? So really preparing for your medicine session and then facilitating a psilocybin administration session with somebody and what that looks like, right? What holding space looks like, how to do that in a non-directive way. That's a really important piece of the psilocybin facilitator training work, is that we're not therapists. We're not directing something. We're not doing interventions with people while they're under the influence of psilocybin. We are holding space. We are there to support them, to keep them safe enough in that vulnerable state, and to offer that loving, attentive care. And therapeutic skills come into that, absolutely, right? But we're not like doing IFS with somebody while they're in psilocybin. And then the integration, right? How do we support someone in those initial stages of integration? How do we help meaning making? What do we do? How do we make sure that someone has the support in their life they need? And a lot of that is, and this is something we talk about with students quite a bit, of like, how do you assess when someone needs a referral? When are you outside of your scope? When do they need a therapeutic practitioner or a specific support group or some kind of medical care, or referring them to some kind of spiritual group or community space that's going to help for that longer term integration? So the time scope is significantly smaller typically with psilocybin services than you would be with somebody who was a therapist or working with a more longer term peer support model. Mm-hmm. And people can be all those things, but there is a very clear distinction around what hat are you wearing, and having to really be intentional about the relationship with the client and being clear about what the boundaries are when you're in each space.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so thinking about, this term practitioner, and we're talking about the facilitator of psilocybin in Oregon specifically, but you're bringing up this whole topic of integration too, and like what is an integration practitioner? And I think you just said you're not doing very like kind of long-term treatment, and I don't even know if treatment's the right word for the Oregon model, but long-term sessions, support. And so that's also another role that people can take on, right? Whether that's through a therapy lens or a coaching lens, and it's not necessarily you working with the actual mushrooms in that session there.
Yeah, and this is something that I have done in my private practice for a long time. You can offer preparation support, you can offer integration support as a therapist, as a coach, as a peer support person in individual or group sessions. Like there's such a range that you can do with that. And that's another way that you can be a part of this field as a practitioner. And you're not sitting with someone while they're, with the medicine, but you are a really important part of that process and a really important part of like the change that is coming out of their life. We talk about this all the time in training programs of like integration is the most important part, right? Like if you don't do the integration, then you've had this wonderful experience. And for some people, really big changes come out of just a single or a couple experiences. But for most people, it is that longer term work that really creates a sustainable change in people's lives that they're looking for. And that healing occurs in relationship, healing occurs in community, right? And so we need those spaces with other people, with other beings to be able to really like lock in and process that work. And so I think a lot of these training programs that, Kyle and I work at that we're seeing now, many people are going to being integration coaches, being integration therapists, especially before MDMA gets rescheduled, psilocybin gets rescheduled, and we're able to do the work in a more above ground regulated way.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be important because people are going to have like really challenging experiences from time to time. And I like to say it feels like we're building the scaffolding of like psychedelic therapies, but we also need to think about the safety net. And I think that's really where a lot of kind of like the integration providers come into play, to provide a little bit of safety net for psychoeducation, support, and kind of looking at that ongoing process for people. I'm just going to make a comment on Jennifer's around the church. And then, if anybody has a question, feel free to use the Q&A. Some of it will wait maybe like another 15 or so minutes. But just wanted to kind of mention, since we're talking about like scope of practice and the church. So a lot of people do a church model and they use the Freedom Restoration Act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as like a foundation for getting a church involved. And Jennifer, you're asking, would medical licenses be needed in that space? And the answer would be no. Actually, listen to this really interesting panel with some lawyers that were they work on churches and the Freedom Restoration Act and whatnot. And one comment they made is that once a church starts to mention that you can help to treat your anxiety, cure your anxiety, that's where you start to get into the medical zone. And that's where FDA and DEA could possibly get more involved, because you're starting to make medical claims. So it's really oriented around the spiritual and religious use of those sacraments, right? And it's oriented around a sacrament from that religious perspective. So just creating a little bit more of that scope of practice and how people are operating and things to be mindful of.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to that,
Yeah,
Kyle?
sure.
And I think, it's specific to know that with the church model, folks can't be like advertising as we're treating your anxiety, we're treating your depression, you're treating your PTSD, and also healing within community treats those things, right? And so it's like we just have to be really aware of what is the setting that we're working in, how are we marketing it, how are we presenting ourselves to the world, because of the system that we currently live and work in, right? Because of the regulation systems that we have and the government systems that we have. And knowing that like being in healing community space helps mental health. Like that is, we know those things. There's lots of research to back that up. There's lots of lived experiences and lineages since time immemorial of work with these medicines that shows that. And so I just want to be careful around saying that like churches don't treat those things, because they do. It's just outside of the Western medical system model.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and it's in that advertising, right? And then you
Exactly.
get to that philosophical question: well, what is healing, right? Who gets to heal? And healing does happen in community. So let's make a. I'm just kind of being a little bit mindful of time. Thinking about training programs. So you're part of our Vital training program, which is more of a certificate program in psychedelic informed practice, risk reduction, and integration, really trying to provide folks the foundations for understanding, psychedelic theory, risk reduction, and then hopefully, being able to get out there and provide some integration support. And you're also part of ALMA, which is a psilocybin facilitator training program specific to Oregon. And so as a lot of different programs are popping up, I guess people probably have all sorts of questions like, which training program do I look at? And then also thinking about what feels really essential for training programs to be teaching people? And I guess it does kind of fall within that scope of practice. What's their goal? Are you training facilitators? Are you doing something else? And yeah, what do you think is essential part of psychedelic education for
Yeah.
practitioners?
Yeah. So I want to answer this question. I think there's a few kind of like core buckets that we have to look at, right? And I think the biggest one for me, and again, this is just my perspective, just one person, is your own inner work. Of that, our own inner work of like our trauma history, our relationship to our privilege and oppression, our relationship to intergenerational work, society, like all of these things are a massive, massive part of who you are as a practitioner when you're working with people. And so for all training programs, having a lens of doing our own inner work while we are learning theories and skills is incredibly important. Any program that isn't centering that, to me, I would be pretty skeptical of. Vital centers that, Alma Institute that I work at centers that, Synaptic Sound Mind, like all these other places that I, also am involved with, know that this is at the core of how to be a practitioner. And that in our kind of Western colonial context now, like education looks really different, right? Since time immemorial, people were trained with these medicines through the apprenticeship model in villages and tribes and ceremonial traditional contexts, and it's different than what we're doing now. And yet this inner work needs to be even more highlighted and intentionally put into curriculum and learning spaces and small groups, that sort of thing. So that is like number one. I would say that looking at work from a trauma-informed lens is incredibly important. All of us have trauma in different ways, and trauma is going to come into the space. And our collective understanding of trauma is changing, thankfully, and we still don't really understand it like as a whole, right? In certain pockets and certain bubbles we do, but I think that needs to be a really core tenet of how we move in this work. Looking at like our own ancestral lineages and really unpacking what it means to be working in relationship with these medicines in a colonial context is incredibly important. Doing a lot of work around like what are our own lineages in relationship to this medicine. How are we not just like stealing from other cultures? How are we not continuing the exploitation of medicine practices of indigenous communities? Like that needs to be really central and focused in these training programs as well, so that we're not perpetuating the massive amount of harms that have been done and exploitation that have been done to indigenous communities. And it's going to happen, right? And we are a part of that process. And so how do we hold both of those things? I would and also say that experientials are huge in this work. I mean, this conversations Kyle and I have had, I think all of us who are in leadership at training programs are constantly asking this question of like, how do we balance Zoom learning with experientials in the age that we're in right now? I think all of us would love to be able to just like send students to apprenticeships for 2 years, 5 years, and also like that's not, for resource wise, that's not something we can do right now. And so what does it look like to make sure that experientials are there, and knowing that like embodied learning and like really feeling it in the soma, in the body, is an incredibly important piece of all of this that links into those other things I talked about, of the self work of trauma informed care, of indigenous perspectives, and honoring our own lineages and connecting to our own lineages pre-colonization in relationship to medicine. So that embodied piece and experientials is woven throughout all of that.
Yeah, super, super important. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we were chatting a little bit before we hopped on here, just talking about the importance of that experiential component. And maybe as things start to really evolve, we'll have more kind of like localized training programs, and where you can do that a little bit more, right? Like I just think about my own process with breathwork training, for example. There was
Yeah.
one organization that did kind of like retreat, and you had to go to a whole bunch of them. They're all over the world, and as I was doing my undergrad, I couldn't afford it, right, to get on a plane, go to these retreats that costed a lot of money. And so it's like that model was a little bit prohibitive. I was able to get training at a local place fortunately, I just was right place, right time, and had some really great teachers. They're only 2 hours away, and I was able to just go down there and have so much in-person mentorship over the years. And then, in the age of Zoom, right? It's like when Psychedelics Today was really trying to like form our vital training program, it was going to kind of mimic a lot of in-person stuff, but the accessibility too of being online, being able to touch people all across the world, right? It makes it a little bit more accessible. And I think it's an important time to have, this type of education from all over the place. But I think as, things get really established over the next decade or so, we'll probably have more localized training programs where people can get that mentorship. And I know people are really, really seeking it out. And I think it's like the most important part of all this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a movement towards that more localized perspective in the field, which I'm really grateful for. Adrienne Maree Brown talks a lot about like the fractal nature of things, and that like we have to be in these little fractals, right? And that like small is all is something you hear a lot in movement spaces of like just staying within your local small community. And I know even in my experience in the field of like co-founding APA, being in this like big national psychedelic nonprofit, and just seeing like what it feels like to try to organize on that level. And now being in more of a small, localized, like grassroots oriented place of like how it feels to be in that level, and even just our own work, our own medicine work, our own teachings with that. And like I'm seeing the field evolve a little bit more kind of back towards that smaller perspective. And so I'm hoping that continues so that we have more options for in-person learning, more options for mentorship, apprenticeship that is like low to the ground, like in connection with the land as much as we possibly can.
Yeah. On this topic of like mentorship and like really hands-on learning, this is maybe a little controversial question depending on who you talk to, but
Yeah.
how long do you think it should take somebody to have training in this to then go out and practice, right? I know in the Oregon model, it was like this became law. We needed practitioners out there to then provide the service. And then, I think folks in Colorado, as they're shaping their law, I think I saw some notes from a meeting that they had. They were saying like, it just also feels too short what the Oregon program is. And it's
Mhm.
like, to some degree, yes. And then on the other hand, it's like, this also needed to go to market too, because it became a law and all that stuff. So like, what is that sweet spot? Like how long should a training program like be, and how long should somebody be mentoring?
Hmm. Yeah. So, well, if I'm going to add a third thing to the Oregon issue is that also accessibility for financial investment, right? People that are paying for training programs, longer training programs cost more money, right? And so much of the policy conversation is pretty consistently this balance of safety and accessibility. And we think those two things go head to head. In some ways they do, in some ways they don't. But it's most policy conversations I've been a part of, this tension has been there. So just wanting to name that as a piece of it too. I don't have an answer for like exactly how long it should be. I think that what we're doing in Oregon, which most programs are like 6 to 7 months, I think is too short. And I am actively participating in something that I think is too short. I, you know, I don't think that anyone should ever stop being mentored. I think that if you're going to be in this field, you need supervision and mentorship and consultation for the rest of your career. Like, no one's ever done with our personal work. No one's ever done learning. I feel very much a student in this work and just happen to be maybe one step ahead of people who I'm leading, and it's like, I'm a couple steps ahead of you, but man, there's a lot more that I don't know than I do know for sure. I would, if I could have everything I wanted, maybe we'll go from that perspective. Like I wish that most training programs were a year or two, that this was like a longer term process. I wish that financially that was something that was accessible, that there was enough resources for that. And I wish that, more of it could be in person, low to the ground, connected with elders and with teachers, like having more of a perspective of like, how do you find your own lineage, whether that's like lineage of blood or lineage of practice for people who don't have connection to their blood lineages for, various reasons. And having that be really at the root of your education. And there's so many this particular iteration and version of this work is very new and we're figuring it out still. yeah, I would love it to be longer, and then have people set up in a community of care and practice that they're getting mentorship, supervision, consultation forever.
Yeah, it's like we kind of need to cast that wide net and then build the structures, and then hopefully,
Yeah.
as we mentioned, it starts to develop over the years. But we're working with a totally new novel field, which is
Mhm.
exciting and something I always like to remind people to be interested in this field. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and uncertainty because
Yes.
nothing is always certain.
And lots of change, lots of
Lots
rapid
of
change.
change. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to just name with this is to know that like there is a massive underground, and that and there's a massive space of like ceremonial and traditional work, right? And those are happening in connection and also separate from what we're talking about. And I think that part of this work is how do we create an environment in the above ground that we're talking about that is inviting, safe, welcoming, that folks who are practicing underground or practicing in ceremonial contexts want to be a part of if they do want to be a part of it. And how do we also create legislation and policy that protects people to practice in ways that they want to outside of the system that we're creating. Like I think both of those things need to happen simultaneously, and that part of the problems that we're talking about in training programs now, like lack of mentors, lack of spaces to do apprenticeship, lack of really like decades long experience of people in the field, is because the system that we're working in is not friendly and welcoming and safe enough for these folks to come practice in, understandably so because of histories of oppression, the drug war, like all of these things. And so part of the work is changing the system to be welcoming such that the people we want to work in it are actually willing to, and at the same time creating a space for them to not want to participate and have that also be okay. So I think both of those things have to happen simultaneously to be able to create the educational structure that we'd like to see.
Yeah, we really need that kind of diverse ecosystem. And
Yeah.
it's like not just one kind of, just the medical route. It's like we need all of
Mhm.
it. And yeah, how do people feel safe? We are still working with scheduled substances, right? And that's like
Yeah.
the scariest thing for a lot of underground practitioners, maybe try to find their communities to work with. So, coming out and saying you do this type of work, could put you at risk, right? So um I'm just being mindful of time again, and I'm noticing there's a bunch of questions, so I just want to ask you one more question and then we'll get to the Q&A box.
Yeah.
So we're talking about kind of like policy, a little bit around regulation, and kind of like the theory around education, and then actually being part of education programs. How do you take theory into practice? And as you started to move into practice, what do you feel has been so essential for you? And
Mm.
maybe what hasn't worked for you? Maybe like what are some things you just kind of threw out the window? You're like, well, that didn't actually work in theory.
Yeah. Um, I mean, the first thing for me that comes up is the thing that I threw out the window. um, and then this actually comes more from my like therapeutic training. I went to like a hippie school outside of Seattle, so it was very, I got kind of the woo-woo spiritual perspective on therapy, but it's still influenced by a lot of Western psychology. And this idea that we have to be a blank slate in the room, the idea that our humanity is not welcome, or that like we're not supposed to self-disclose, the idea that we could possibly not self-disclose by just like having a body and our clothing choices. But I think the thing I threw out the window was that like the relationship with people you're working with your clients isn't very dependent on who you are as a person. And so my work with people, again, I'm a somatic trauma therapist and psychedelic therapist, and I am myself in the room most of the time. That doesn't mean that I'm telling people about my life or talking about myself, but that like my personality and my life are a part of this work, and matter and are a part of the relationship. And so definitely like toss the blank slate, therapist blank slate thing out the window. I would say that the theory that has translated for me the most is like how to be in my body, connected to myself and also connected to another person at the same time, and how to track and attune from a body level, like a nervous system level, from an energetics level, and also from like that cognitive intellectual level that we get trained in, of how to analyze people, how to see defense mechanisms, all that sort of stuff. So that's really been really important. a lot of so I'm trained in internal family systems. I do somatic work with people. I'm trained in EMDR, and have a very strong relational perspective in my work. I do a lot of consent trainings in the field. And so there's a strong consent, queer, feminist, anti-oppression lens to my work as well with people. And all of those things are born out of work that I have done on myself or work that I have done in community spaces. And so I think that for like training programs are going to teach an array of different skills. They're going to teach an array of different theories. And as somebody who, for folks that are listening, like if you are wanting to be a facilitator or in those beginning stages or in later stages, so much of the work is like what resonates with you in your humanity, in your life, and how does that then something that you can connect with other people around and hold space for? It doesn't mean you have to work with people who are exactly like you. We need to be able to work with people who are very different from us. But what is that resonant field between the two of you that you can really connect with? And what are the tools and skills and ways of practice that work for you that you can then offer from a very grounded, embodied, like accountable place, where you feel like you are in your sense of just integrity with yourself of how you're working and moving. And for me, that looks like a lot of parts work. I have a lot of parts work training. I have a lot of somatic training, and looking at things from a real trauma lens, whether it's individual, intergenerational, systemic trauma. And there was one other thing I wanted to say. I think just wanted to say a little bit more about the relational piece. And again, like as practitioners, we get to decide how we want to be a practitioner. There's so many different ways to be in a room with a client and relate to a client. Obviously, we have safety things and ethical boundaries we have to adhere to. And within that, and for me at least, seeing the relationship between myself and the person I'm working with as a part of the healing process is central to the way that I work. We have some research that shows that the majority of the change that happens, at least in therapy context, is because of the relationship, and that whatever modality you do doesn't matter. And so taking that into psychedelic work and understanding that the vulnerability, the suggestibility, the deep intimacy and connection that comes from this work is held within a relationship between the two of us. And so how do we create a relational space that is safe enough to go into these practices, go into the subconscious, go into the messy, the darkness, like all of these things, in a way that feels like really accountable to the humans in the room, while also not ignoring the fact that this is a very genuine connection that's happening. And I think that takes a lot of consistent self-work to be able to be in that space with people and not have our own stuff come up into it and get projected into it, and also have our own stuff come up into it and be able to navigate it and work with it, in the moment and throughout the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's like the one main thing I always come back to is like, yeah, that self work, and like, because we're gonna get triggered, especially in those states, and how do we
Oh
work
yeah.
with that? I come back to a lot of like somatic theory, but
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's the most important part. It's like, how do we sit with ourselves? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there was a question I wanted to ask and it just slipped my head. Oh, I know what it was. For those that like may not feel like they're ready to take a jump into maybe enrolling into a psychedelic specific program, are there specific like skills training programs, like things that people could look at to start building their foundation?
Yeah. All sorts of things. I mean, there's like, I'm thinking about trainings like Hakomi training or internal family systems, somatic experiencing, breathwork experiences. Those are things you don't have to be a licensed practitioner to get training in. So if you wanted like some kind of training in that way, you could do it. But then also things like volunteering with harm reduction and peer support organizations, volunteering with Fireside, volunteering with the Zendo Project or Dance Safe. I think those are fantastic ways to get experience in the field and experience holding space for and with people who are on psychedelic journeys or integrating, without the full investment of paying for a full training program or some of those other advanced trainings that I talked about. Um, yeah, I think those would be good ways, good entrances in.
Awesome, thank you. All right, we'll go to the Q&A box.
Okay.
So let's see, Bradley was asking, I know psilocybin, but can you talk more about how MDMA is used, and is it natural, and what other psychoactive drugs are available?
Yeah, let's see how MDMA is used. So MDMA is synthetic, and so it's something that's made in the lab. There is kind of roots in sassafras, which is a plant, and MDMA currently is only in legal context. MDMA is currently only being used in research in the United States, and it's been designated as a breakthrough drug. We're in phase 3 with FDA, and DEA rescheduling. So in 2019 they told us a year, and it's been like a year every year, so it keeps getting pushed back. I think the last I heard was like maybe the end of 2024, but we'll see. Governments move slowly, so we're on track to have MDMA get rescheduled and be available for therapeutic use, and psilocybin probably not far behind in that process as well. And then there's lots of psychedelic work going on all over the place in different contexts. In the US, that's what we're looking at. And I know there's some policies in different states around trying to have access to ayahuasca and 5-MeO-DMT and different psychedelic structures. I'm not as familiar with the details of those policies, though.
And then if you happen to live in Australia, Australia legalized MDMA and psilocybin for very specific uses, and needs to be under the supervision of psychiatrists. And I think they're still rolling all that out, but that was really interesting that they passed that.
Yeah, and in like Latin and Central and South America, there's a lot of availability within specific community contexts for these medicines, and in Africa and all over the world, there's like very different landscape for uses of medicines. And so, if you're interested in something specific, I would encourage you to look it up in the different cultures that historically hold those medicines and what kind of practices are needed to access those.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Tiffany, where are you teaching these tools? I'm going to school to be a licensed therapist and have about 15 years facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies. I like to learn from you how to integrate my knowledge with your training. Thank you.
Yeah, so where are you teaching these tools? So is that, Kyle, do you understand this is a question of like the training program names, or?
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
makes
So
sense.
me personally, so I work at Vital with Psychedelics Today. I'm one of the small group study leaders. I'm the director of education at Alma Institute, ALMA. I also am on faculty at Sound Mind Institute and Synaptic Institute. And then I guest teach at most of the training programs, not all of them, but most of them. And a lot of that guest teaching is around trauma-attuned consent in psychedelic spaces and how we really center consent processes as we're developing relationship and preparing for psychedelic sessions.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And take a look at like all those different programs. Something that I think the question I get asked the most is like, what program do I look at? And I think you have to think about like what scope of practicing you're going down. So if you do live in Oregon and you want to get licensed as a facilitator, maybe check out an Oregon specific license program. If you're looking at something that's more oriented towards risk reduction, harm reduction, integration, all that stuff, look at programs and look at the philosophy, like look at who's like behind it. Does it align, like as you were saying, Emma, there's so many different ways of going about this and really thinking about what feels right to you. So yeah, there's tons of stuff out there, and just like look behind and think about the philosophy and what feels right for you. All right. Can you talk about ketamine treatment? I'm a psychologist in Philadelphia. I'm interested.
Yeah. So I'm ketamine trained. I have experience with ketamine assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine there's an array of different ways that ketamine is used right now in the field because it's so unregulated, which is, I think, both a blessing and a curse, as many things are in different ways. My perspective with ketamine, then what I am training and what I have done is specifically ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which is different than ketamine infusion treatment. So ketamine assisted psychotherapy, typically what that looks like is that you have to have a prescriber, so somebody who's screening people, prescribing the medication, the ketamine medication, and then as the therapist, counselor, psychologist, support person, whatever your term is, whatever your title is, you are sitting with somebody through their experience, and you've done prep sessions with them, and you're doing integration sessions with them. The context that I have done it in was within the container of my private practice, and so I was having longer. When I do this, I have longer term relationships with people because trauma work, specifically complex PTSD, just is a longer term process. But there are lots of people and lots of clinics that do the shorter term ketamine work where a couple prep sessions, medicine sessions, couple integration sessions. And typically with ketamine, you need multiple rounds of it. It's pretty rare that people are just doing one ketamine session. There's different protocols that folks do, but most people are usually doing like 3 to 6 ketamine sessions over some span of time. And there's group work. People do group work with people do group work with ketamine. Is less popular, I have found. I think probably because of the dissociative aspect of ketamine, but we do see that.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see there. Another question: what are the requirements for people from foreign countries want to do the training program?
Well, different training programs have different requirements. So I can speak like at Alma, we take people who are not just Oregon and who aren't going to get licensed in Oregon, but are going to practice in other places. And so just, I mean, the training requirements really are the same based on where you are. It's more of like what context you want to practice in afterwards. Whereas like Vital has a way more like people from all over the world coming in, I think because of your context and because of it being more of like a psychedelic facilitator training program and something that has more of a broader scope and is focused on harm reduction and integration. Whereas at Alma, we're focused more on that like psilocybin training, and people are using that in different contexts, but most people are Oregon based because of the licensure route that we have in our state here.
Yeah, and I just would love to just, remind you to maybe check out where your local laws and what's going on. So yeah, here in Vital, we take this like risk reduction integration approach, and then also provide a little bit of those like facilitation skills at our retreats. And people are using it in all sorts of different ways. People end up taking our program to want to just become psychedelically literate and competent. Maybe they come from not a therapy world, and they just want to get involved some way. And so yeah, I guess just to emphasize, Vital is a pretty inclusive program, and we're not just specific towards licensed professionals. And the reason why is because, we're thinking about how the laws are changing, watching out Oregon is becoming a little bit more inclusive and, not needing a professional license to get involved. And then also just thinking about how much education we need out there, right? A lot of the education programs are kind of behind, needing a license to get in there. And, our kind of belief is that the more educated people out there that can be advocates, educators, like community leaders, we're still battling a lot of stigma in the world. We might be in a little psychedelic bubble at times, but that's not the entire world. And to be educated, and I like to say like developing that psychedelic literacy and competency, so then you can go into your community, maybe be an advocate, an educator, if you are a practitioner some way, again, being that safety net. Maybe you do have clients coming in saying, I just took a psychedelic and I had this really difficult trip. Being educated, maybe knowing where to point people towards. So yeah, as Emma mentioned, there's going to be different requirements based on the training program that you're looking at, but also look where you're living and thinking about like why you want to sign up for it, maybe what you want to be doing, and trying to plan ahead there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Heather was asking about MDMA change. I think you mentioned that. Yeah, the most recent thing that we heard is, end of 2024 is when rescheduling is supposed to happen. But
really, we don't know.
Yeah.
We're at the whim of the government.
Yep. Yep. All right. Brian, can churches make claims such as healing spiritual religious trauma or spiritual religious anxiety? What type of wording work in a non-medical model? It's a good question. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of what we talked about earlier. Like you can't say you're like healing trauma from an advertising perspective, but you could say that, and this is just my understanding of it, and I'm not an expert in this by any means. My understanding is that you could say like we create spaces for people who have experienced these things. We have community groups that are focused on people who've experienced religious or spiritual trauma, and we are helping support people through their work of healing that through a spiritual lens with the specific sacrament we're working with. So I think a lot of it is about languaging of just like what public facing information you're putting up, and knowing that maybe what you're doing is working on healing that religious trauma. But it's just the linguistics around it.
Yeah. We're not lawyers, but I don't know if you talk to lawyers, but I've talked to
Sometimes.
different lawyers on all this stuff, and yeah, it seems like it's around the advertising how you're talking about it, and then again, if you're once you get into treating any sort of medical issue, such as anxiety, that's where like a board could come in and say, are you a licensed professional and do you have authority to treat anxiety, right? So thinking about like professional counselors, having the authority to assess, treat, diagnose anxiety, depression, stuff like that. So that's like that fine line between, with regulated professions and the medical world. See, Manuel, you have a question about ketamine treatment. I'm a licensed counselor interested in preparation, in session support, and integration. I'm finding out that clients are on high dose treatment, ego dissociating sessions, 600 milligrams weekly, but there's zero integration sessions. Is there best practice or at least a standard protocol involving preparation other than medical assessment and post integration?
Mm. Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of this in the field right now. There's a lot of people offering and practicing high dose, pretty intensive ketamine treatment without the preparation and integration support. That scares me, just to be honest. I've seen it work for lots of people, and I've also seen it be pretty harmful for lots of folks. So in terms of best practices, we don't have like an agreed upon best practice. I would encourage you to look up Raquel Bennett. Raquel is somebody who has done a lot of work around building standards with ketamine. She's been in the ketamine world for a long time. She has an ethics code for ketamine practitioners. So I would encourage you looking at that through the KRIA Institute. That's probably going to be the best place to go to get the most up-to-date information around that. She knows much more than I do about it. And what I would say is that, specifically preparation around just like what kind of work have people done? What are the tools that they have that they're going to be able to support themselves with throughout the process? What are their intentions for the work? And and then on the other end, right? Like what does integration support look like? Where are places where they can talk about what's going on for them? A lot of the infusion treatment places and just like the ketamine only are looking at it through a really medical and biological, like chemical model of ketamine changing the brain structure. And it does have naturally antidepressant effects. And there are big psychedelic experiences people are having in those ketamine sessions that typically contribute to the alleviation of, treatment resistant depression or suicidality, which is typically what we're using ketamine to treat. And so people need spaces to be able to process those things. And so making sure that there's some kind of space set up for folks, I would say is a pretty important part of the process.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. We have 3 minutes left. How are you on time? Can you go
I'm good. I
over?
can go a little bit over.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to get through all these questions, folks, but thank you so much for putting them in the chat here.
Cruising
Time.
through them too and see
Yeah.
if there's ones that jump out.
Do you want to pick ones that jump out at you? And sorry if we're being a
Sure.
little
No, you're good. I
slow.
was just like, if there's, let's see. Oh, these are all great. I don't know, Kyle, you just keep going.
It's hard. It's hard. Thank you, everybody. You guys are amazing. I do like this one question around psychologizing the field and psychologizing therapy.
Really?
And what are your thoughts on that? I'm just kind of paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your feelings on psychedelics becoming attached to therapy in an obligatory way?
Yeah, I don't think that should be mandatory at all. I think that there needs to be support, but I think that support can come in all sorts of ways. I am a therapist. I exist within the psychology world, and so that's what I offer. I also have deep practices from the shamanism world, and also I'm deeply connected to my Celtic Druidry ancestry, and that informs a lot of the work that I do. And so that's me personally. I also I don't think that therapists have the answer to lots of things. I think that peer support is incredibly helpful and wonderful when it's in the right context. I think that ceremonial support, I think that different kind of spiritual spaces, it really comes down to like what kind of support does the person need in order to integrate and in order to kind of hold them through their process, and that being the thing to drive like how you find your space, right? It's one of the reasons that I'm a strong advocate of having multiple different spaces of access to psychedelic work. Churches, adult regulated use, community spaces, decriminalization, legal medical spaces. Like, I think we need a wide variety so that people can feel the sovereignty to be able to choose something that works for them. And that there's a lot of work done that needs to be done in that, especially from the systemic level, in order to create those access points, and create spaces that are safe enough for people of all sorts of different identities and community backgrounds. So yeah, I think that there is an over psychologizing of the field. I would agree with that statement. And my hope is that, through the work that we're doing, we can create more points of access for people who don't have licenses, because I don't think that somebody with a mental health license is necessarily any better at this than somebody who doesn't have a mental health license. And I would like to see us really tear down that hierarchy in our field, and just see it more of like, what kind of support does this person need? And let's get them connected with somebody who offers that kind of support. And the letters after their name might indicate that, and probably don't.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and something that I always mention is kind of bringing in a lot of my transpersonal training is that, how do we validate and support people that have mystical experiences without saying, I just say this, like trauma boxing it, right? Like putting it in a box of trauma, like, oh, you had this experience with this entity, then this must relate to, your mother and the abuse that happened or something along those lines, right? Like, how do we say, that sounds like a real experience from a transpersonal perspective? And I
Yeah.
think that gets, tricky when we just get too psychologically oriented at times. I
Yeah.
think that's where philosophy also helps to, also look at things from a different perspective. And yeah, as you were saying, like shamanic traditions and all these other worldviews and cosmologies that can hold those types of experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many different ways to look at all the different things, right? And like, there's no, when I'm in an educator seat, like something I really try to impart to people I'm working with, and something that I try to practice myself, is like, there is no one right way to do this. And anybody who thinks there is, like, needs to do their own work. And so we have to find what works for us, right? And find communities and do the work for those communities to feel safe enough to be able to do it in the way that works for them. Because there's a lot of systemic pressure that does not allow for that right now. And so I think that we need to really like uplift the sovereignty of people's relationship with the medicine, and that, we are the ones doing the healing on ourselves. And so we need to be able to create the spaces to support that.
Definitely, definitely. Well, I know we're a little over time, and if anybody had to jump at the hour, just want to say thank you for hanging out with us today and taking some time here. And just want to remind folks that our applications are open for our Vital program that are going to be kicking off in January. Our start date is January 23rd. So I just dropped the link in the chat, and it's just vitalpsychedelictraining.com. And awesome. It looks like, oh, Emma.
I'm putting my website in there. People want to get a hold of me. That's how you find me.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thank you for putting that in there. Do we want to close out with one more question? I think I have to get rolling here as
Yeah.
well. Cool.
Yeah. Let's pick
You want to
one.
pick one?
Oh, no, you're doing such a great job. You can go. Yeah, I'll trust you.
Cool. And then Jerry, you had a question around the organizations. I dropped all those links in the chat, so hopefully you can check those out. Let's see. Here's a question by Sean. I'm trying to decide between pursuing a master's in counseling psychology and a PsyD. Does one of those options feel like it's more compatible with or more advantageous for somebody who wants psychedelic assisted therapy or a major component in his career? I think that's a great question, a question we get asked all the time. Like, what type of training do I need?
Yeah. From my perspective, if you want to do research, or if it's important for you to be a doctor, then go get a PsyD. If you don't want to do research, or if it's not important for you to have the doctor term in front of your name, Masters of Counseling probably will be enough to do this work. And there's also like Masters of Counseling tend to have is oftentimes like you can find programs that are less academically like structured in terms of like the research academic world. PsyDs tend to be more adherent to that space. That's been my experience with it. Yeah. Kyle, what do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, this is a question that, I've been asked plenty of times. And so thinking about my own experience, I was going back and forth. I was looking at grad schools forever. I ended up going down the counseling route with a clinical counseling degree because I was just looking at like the curriculum and scope of practice of a psychologist, and I wanted to get to work earlier. And not wanting to get bogged down too much into some of the assessment stuff that psychologists take on. And I had a lot of colleagues and mentors that were in that realm, and I said, you know what, counseling feels like it aligns with what I want to be doing, and I like that. But the question I always ask folks is, if you are interested in getting involved in psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelics, and you're going down the therapy and counseling route, ask yourself, do you see yourself doing therapy without the psychedelic?
Mhm.
Because there's going to be a lot of therapy that you're probably going to be doing outside of psychedelic sessions. And do you see yourself wanting to work with people in that scope? And if you say, yes, I really want to work with people, I would kind of want to become a counselor, therapist, psychologist, then yeah, then start asking yourself the question, like, what program aligns with me? I looked at social work programs, PhDs, societies, every program under the sun. But really start with that. Like, do you see yourself doing therapy without psychedelics? And really kind of hone in on those skills of becoming a really good therapist first, because we think about the preparation, the assessment, and the integration. The substance or the medicine part is only going to be a small part of that, right? And so I think that's a really important question to ask yourself. And if you asked me 5+ years ago, I would say you need to get a clinical degree. Now that things are changing, people are finding entry points into all sorts of different avenues. Whether it is that kind of unlicensed Oregon track, and as more states maybe adopt that and follow that model, those opportunities will open up. But also thinking about the services that you want to give to the world, right? And how do you become maybe a little bit more psychedelically literate to then maybe showcase that? So, as a psychedelic business owner, I'm like, I really would love like I mean, we have accountants that understand psychedelics, but in the beginning, it's like, who are the accountants that can understand psychedelics? So we need to explain everything. Where are like the lawyers who know this type of language? Like graphic artists that really understand psychedelic experiences, where we don't need to explain things to folks, or just like admin people, right? It would be like, hey, like I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, I don't need to explain what DMT is, right? It's like people have that literacy, and it's like, they're again, the field is growing slowly, and the opportunities may not be there. But also thinking about, how do you position yourself? Like when I started to go to school in 2010 to study psychedelics, and thinking about that, everybody's like, what are you going to school for? That doesn't even exist. But thinking down the line, it will exist, but maybe not for another 40-50 years or something like that. So just some other considerations too on like maybe how to crack into the field.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great question to think about.
Yeah. And then there's just one more question. And Heather was asking about MDMA training and certifications. And I think, this is another question we get asked all the time. And I think it's important to kind of, talk about. Yeah. So if you are interested in MDMA, that's going to be down the route with MAPS. So MAPS is going to be the MDMA training provider. And I think they have exclusivity over it for a few years. And they are still working out all the training requirements for that, especially now that it's starting to get approval for FDA. They need to work with the FDA to figure out how to roll out that training program. So that will end up being the route. I think they've put some of it on pause. There might be some training programs, education programs that do the education piece, but their extended training piece, they're still trying to figure out all those logistics with the FDA.
Yeah, there's a whole experiential aspect of the MAPS training that there's just not anywhere to do it.
Yeah.
Like they had an MT2 study where they like did a study on all the people in the training program, but that was a couple years ago. And so you can get the didactic aspect of the MAPS training done now, through some other training programs or through MAPS specifically. And so if you're interested in that, just go on the MAPS website, check it out, get yourself on the wait list, or look at other training programs that offer that through their curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Awesome, Emma. Well, thank you so much for your time, your
So
wisdom, your
good.
inspiration here. This has been really fun. And thank you, everybody, again, for hanging out with us for the hour. Do you want to close with anything, Emma?
Um, no, just thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Kyle. This was fun. Yeah, feel
Yeah.
free to reach out to me, folks, if interested in connecting. Yeah, and hope to see you in the field. We need people. So
Yes,
yeah.
we do. And sorry if we didn't get to all the questions. There will be a replay. I think I saw a question about replay.
Okay.
There will be a replay. We'll send that out to everybody. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Emma or us at Psychedelics Today. So thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great week. And we'll catch you soon. Take care.